Hello everyone and welcome back to Fly From Home. It's Catman here with another aircraft review for Microsoft Flight Simulator. And today, as you may have guessed, it's the Carenado Cessna 337 or 337 Hotel, the Skymaster 2, which has been released a few days ago. And picked this up courtesy of Carenado. Thank you very much to them. Because I've always been a big fan of this aeroplane. I've never actually flown one in real life, but I've always wanted to, and I thought, oh, it'd be a good aeroplane to review for the channel and let you guys know what I think of it. So, a little bit of spiel before we get into things. For those of you not familiar with these aircraft reviews, I do tend to go on a bit. So there's going to be some timestamps below. You can skip around to the bits you're going to be interested in and miss the bits you aren't going to be too interested in to make sure your attention does not wane too much. A little bit about myself. I am a commercial flying instructor. I teach multi-engine instrument ratings, commercial pilot's license, PPL, pretty much most of the main sort of courses that you'd go through to become an airline pilot in the United Kingdom. I've been teaching for about 5 years. I've got about 16 or 1700 hours, I can't even remember. But I'm reasonably competent, I'd like to think. And this is just going to be my opinions of the aeroplane, what I think of it personally. You could have a completely different opinion of it and think I'm talking rubbish, and you are perfectly entitled to that. So a format of the video, how things are going to go. First of all, I'm going to have a little talk about the history of the real aircraft. We're then going to have a look around the aircraft in the hangar, what it looks like, the external model, the internal model, looking at the cockpits and all the instrumentation and switches and everything. And then we'll have a look at the different liveries that Carenado supply with this aeroplane. And then we're going to go out and we're going to do a test flight in standard conditions where we're going to have a look at the performance with reference to real-world book figures. We're going to have a look at the handling characteristics of the aircraft, including steep turns and stalls. And then we're going to do a little bit of navigation, followed by a circuit session where we do the standard sort of multi-engine aircraft circuit detail, which includes standard landing, flapless approach and landing, and then an engine failure after takeoff into a single engine circuit and a landing. I'll then come to my conclusions about the aeroplane at the end. So if you're still awake and you're still listening, congratulations to you, because we're going to get into the first part of the video now, which is going to be a little bit of history. So the Skymaster is produced in the United States by the Cessna Corporation, of course one of the most famous makers of light aircraft in the world. What's special about this airplane? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. It's got an engine at the front and it's got an engine at the back. It is a push-me-pull-you, which makes it pretty, well, not completely unique, but pretty special. There aren't that many pusher-puller aeroplanes out there. So it's certainly a very interesting design. It's also got a twin-boom rear fuselage and a big sort of horizontal stabilizer at the back, so a very distinctive looking aircraft. Twin tails, I mean, twin tails are always cool, aren't they? I mean, it's basically an F-15, right, or a P-38 or something like that. Okay, so the first Skymaster, the 336, which has fixed landing gear, originally flew in February 1961 and went into production in May 1963. Now this was a reasonably popular aeroplane. But Cessna thought, nah, let's try and go one better. So in 1965 they introduced this version. This is the Super Skymaster. It's got a slightly larger fuselage, wider, longer fuselage. It's got more powerful engines, and it also has possibly the most hilariously complicated landing gear you will ever see on a light aircraft. I'm going to show you this in flight when we're out in the simulator, because it almost beggars belief how complicated the retraction of this landing gear is. Other than that, it's a fairly standard-looking Cessna twin. If you sort of ignore all the funky stuff that happens from the trailing edge of the wing backwards, it's very similar to a Cessna 210 in the way it looks, and apparently in the way it flies as well. One of the considerations with an aircraft like this, of course, is the fact that that rear-mounted engine does not have as free an access to air as the front one does. So you can see the front one has got the standard light aircraft air intakes either side of the prop. The rear one has to make do with this scoop on the roof, which is perfectly adequate when you're flying, but can be a little bit lacking when you're on the ground, because obviously on the ground the front engine has the benefit of the propeller slipstream feeding air in there. The rear one does not, so there's obviously a possibility of the rear engine overheating. Something else to think about with this configuration of aeroplane is if you have an engine failure. Now, most conventional piston twins, if you have an engine failure, it's very obvious. The aircraft starts yawing and rolling and all sorts of other nasty stuff, which clues you in very quickly into the fact that one of your engines has stopped working. If you were to have a rear engine failure in this aircraft, you're not really going to hear it. You will notice it performance-wise, but it's going to be fairly incipient rather than a sudden dramatic change in performance. So it's quite possible to completely not notice the fact that the rear engine isn't working, and this would be really dangerous if it happened on the ground and you go for the takeoff roll and you've only got the front engine available, you don't have the performance required to get off on the length of runway you've got, and obviously can result in some really dangerous situations. So there are some techniques you can do as a pilot to get around that. Now, what are the advantages to having a pusher-puller type configuration in your aircraft? Well, first of all, you can have all of the benefits of a multi-engine aeroplane. You can have the added performance and the added redundancy of a second engine without the nasty asymmetric effects that I was talking about earlier. So when you lose an engine in a standard piston twin, like I said, all sorts of crazy things happen. In this aeroplane, not a great deal. Which can mean that this aeroplane is much safer to have an engine failure in, basically. Not that you ever want to have an engine failure, but if you were to have an engine failure close to the ground after takeoff, high power setting, low airspeed, worst case scenario, it's going to result in much less yaw and roll. And also, you don't have any kind of minimum control speed. So if you're too slow, if you're below the blue line speed, VMCA, in a conventional aircraft, conventional twin, then potentially you're going to lose control of the aircraft. In this type of configuration, like I said, you're going to lose a bunch of performance, but you aren't going to lose control of the aircraft. So that can be really, really good. The other thing is, if you've watched any of my other videos, you've probably heard me talk about critical engines and things like that on twin-engine aircraft that have both engines turning the same way, which is the majority of them. One engine has its thrust line closer to the fuselage, the other has its thrust line further away from the fuselage. So that means that if you lose the critical engine, which in most conventional aircraft which have the propellers turning to the right is the left-hand engine, you have a much greater yaw effect off that surviving right-hand engine, which means it's much harder to keep the aircraft under control. Now, you can counteract that by having both engines turning inwards towards the fuselage, like a Seneca, for example. However, that means your engines have to be specifically designed to spin in opposite directions. You have to have ancillaries that work in opposite directions and all sorts of other expensive stuff, which adds to the initial purchase price of the aeroplane. And, of course, the purchase price of new engines and new parts, new alternators, vacuum pumps, all those sorts of things that all have to spin in opposite directions. So it can make the maintenance costs of the aeroplane very, very high as well. With this aircraft, both of the engines are exactly the same, and all they've done is flipped the back one round and whacked it on in the other direction. So the front one turns in the standard right turning configuration, and the back one also turns in the standard right turning configuration. However, because it's spun round, it's essentially sitting backwards, it's spinning in the opposite direction to the front propeller. So the propeller slipstream and the asymmetric effects of the two propellers are offset, and you basically get an aeroplane which has almost no yaw induced by power settings, which is really handy, and again makes the aeroplane a little bit easier to fly, a little bit more comfortable to fly. In terms of the handling characteristics of the real aeroplane, apparently it flies, as I said, very much like a Cessna 210. It's lovely and stable. It's got a very, very effective elevator, as you might imagine, because it sits right in this slipstream from this rear engine. But in terms of roll and yaw and everything, it's a fairly heavy aeroplane. It's got a fair bit of inertia. It's very, very nose heavy on landing, which we shall see if it's if this aircraft. I'm not going to spoiler you. We'll see if this aircraft has that effect when we actually go and fly it. So it requires a lot of nose up trim. One interesting fact about this aircraft: it actually has an automatic trim system, which prevents you from using full nose up trim when you have flap fully retracted. So that's just there to prevent the aircraft getting into some kind of dangerous nose high situation. Kind of a little bit similar to the well, similar but in reverse to the trim limiting or the backstop limiting system that the DA-42 has, which is an aeroplane I'm flying off. But yeah, there we go. So the Skymaster, made in the 60s, reasonably popular aeroplane, at least in the United States. About 3,000 Skymasters were made, including just over 500 of the military version, the O2, which was actually used in Vietnam as a spotter and even a light strike aircraft. You could stick some bombs under the wings. Pretty interesting. The aircraft went out of production in the early 1980s, but it was continued for a little bit by Reims in France, who are a partner of Cessna, for a little bit longer. So that's the Cessna Skymaster. You will probably see it knocking around today in all sorts of different roles. They're fairly popular in the States, and there's also a few knocking around in Australia. Very, very rare in the UK. I've only ever seen one of them sitting in a hangar collecting dust, and I've sort of stared wistfully at it because, like I said, this is really an aeroplane that I've always kind of wanted to have a crack in, but sadly never got to have a go. But yeah, air taxi, they're great apparently for air observer type roles, because as you can see, the pilot sits forward of the leading edge of the wing, so you've got a great view upwards, and you also have the traditional Cessna fantastic view downwards as well. So they're great for viewing the ground, getting pictures, all that kind of stuff. So they're often used as spotting aircraft for fishing fleets, for example, in Australia. So yeah, that's it really. That's the Cessna Skymaster. Really interesting, really quirky little aeroplane. So how do we think we've gone? How do we think Carenado has done in terms of the visual model for the aircraft? Well, most of you who know about Flight Simulator, not just Microsoft Flight Simulator, but anything that Carenado has made aircraft for, you'll know that they generally hit the nail right on the head with the visual models, and I think this is no exception. It looks absolutely brilliant. They've modelled every single screw and rivet in the right place. You can see the skin of the aircraft. You've got that slight sort of undulation. It's traditional Carenado Microsoft Flight Simulator texture in that it's depicting an aircraft which is obviously very, very well looked after. It's lovely, shiny and clean for the most part, but there is weathering around the usual spots which an aircraft like this would get dirty, around the exhausts for the rear engine, and also around the exhaust for the front engine as well. We'll see that when we're flying a little bit better. The underside of the aircraft does have a bit of dirt on it. But yeah, the external model, absolutely stunning, pin sharp textures, beautiful reflections. All the you can see the reflections on the stickers on the propeller. I mean, stuff like that is absolutely fantastic. You can see all the little static wicks on here. These are actually animated and they wobble around in the airflow and all that kind of stuff. So 10 out of 10 really marks for the external model. You cannot get better external models, I think, in any flight simulator than what Carenado turn out for Microsoft Flight Simulator right now. So really can't really pick the bones out of that one. Let's pop inside a second and have a look what the interior looks like. And we can see this lovely grey panel here, and traditional cockpit with steam gauges. So all you fans of steam gauges, rejoice, it's not another G1000 fit. It has got a bunch of custom-made gauges which are different to any of the other Carenado aircraft. They're all custom-made. They all work very nicely. There's a bit more functionality in this aeroplane than with previous Microsoft Flight Simulator releases that they've made. A few more of the switches have been modelled and work, which is always nice to see. Some of them don't, which we won't get into. Also, the interiors do change depending on which livery you've got selected. So they've modelled a number of different interior texture packs as well. So really, really cool. In here, something else which I really appreciate is that you can swap out the Microsoft Flight Simulator default 530 for the PMS GTN 750, which I think is a really, really good mod add-on type thing. You can pay for it to get the premium version, which I have done because I'm a huge fan of it. but the free version is really, really good too. We've also got the default Microsoft Flight Simulator weather radar, because you may have noticed the big pod under the right-hand wing. That is a weather radar. This is pretty good. It's pretty functional. It certainly paints the bad weather on it, and it's really helpful when you're flying around in IFR. It's got a fairly useful autopilot, and you can see the all the mode selectors for the autopilot there. And we'll have a look at some of the different controls and gauges in the cockpit as we start the actual flight. But I mean, as with the outside model, you really cannot pick any bones out of the interior. It is absolutely stunning, and you can see the little bits of wear on the switches and the control wheel there for the pitch mode on the autopilot. I mean, it's really, really, really well done. So top marks for that. So before we get into the sim and start actually flying around, let's have a quick look at all of the different different liveries you can get for this aircraft. So you've got this nice bright green one. This is a little bit of a change for Carenado. They've actually modelled these liveries after real Skymasters out there in the real world, rather than just taking the styles of the liveries and then allowing you to put your own reg on there. You can now fly with some real-world regs on that, which is cool. November 79252, sorry. Lovely red-looking aircraft. Very, very nice, vivid red. Really like this one. 5 Juliet Delta. Ah, yes, hearing aid beige. There's always one, isn't there, in this delightfully fetching, shall we say, brown colour. 627 6 kilo, lovely blue and white. You know, I'm always a fan of the blue and whites, so it's very, very nice looking. It's the only non-US registered aircraft here. It's Victor Hotel Sierra Bravo Zulu, Australian aircraft. This is my favourite. Really, really nice. It looks like a more modern sort of colour scheme's been applied to this one, and it really suits the aircraft. Very, very nice dark blue underside, and some stripes and white bits on the top. And finally, we've got 3271 at Sierra, which is it's just white, so fair play. If you want something a bit more plain, we've got a white one here. There's also a whole bunch of skins for this aircraft that have already popped up on flightsim.to, so go and check those out if you've got this aeroplane and you want to add some more skins to it. There are plenty out there, and they do look really good. I've not tried any of them yet, but I think I might give the O2 military livery a go at some point. Okay, so here we are now in the simulator at our standard starting location of Doncaster Sheffield Airport in the north of the UK. Again, for those of you not familiar with these reviews, I always do the same route because I'm incredibly boring, and also because it allows me to create control conditions that we can use to test the aircraft out in a standardized way. So we're going to be taking off from Doncaster, climbing up to about 5,500 feet. And we'll check the performance of the aircraft on the way, both climb performance and cruise speed performance in a fast cruise. We'll then slow things down a little bit, go into a general handling type sortie, so we'll do some steep turns, some stalls, and just check the overall sort of handling and feel of the aeroplane. We'll then head off on a nav segment back to over to Nottingham Airport, and that's where we're going to do our circuits. So you can see we've got our aeroplane all parked up here with some little cones and chocks and an external power unit and all that kind of stuff, and it really does look absolutely brilliant in the simulator's lighting. That external model looks absolutely stunning. First things first, we've just going to check our loading, our fuel. So I've set this up to give us about £3,800, which is what the aircraft performance documentation uses as one of its datum figures for a sort of moderate loading. So we've got figures for £3,800 weight and standard atmospheric conditions, so ICAO standard atmosphere, 15 degrees at sea level, and 10-13 hectopascals of pressure as well. So that's exactly what we've got set up in the simulator right now. No wind, no weather, and standardized ICAO standard conditions. So we should be able to replicate the performance figures depicted in the aircraft documentation assuming Carenado did a good job of modelling the aeroplane. So fingers crossed. Pop inside now, and we'll get rid of the static elements, and what's our pilot and co-pilot not going to go in there? Interesting. Okay, that's slightly strange. It wouldn't allow me to put the pilot and co-pilot in until the doors were closed. Okay, so all of the static elements are off, pilot and co-pilot are in, and the doors are shut. Now, this is the default setup. You get... That's incredibly loud. Okay, something's started up like 20 miles away and it's making insane amounts of noise. Yeah, I think that's not our aeroplane. That's the AI Skymaster over there. So what seems to be happening is the AI is making noise, and therefore our aeroplane's making noise, which is extremely annoying. So I guess you could get around this by ticking the option that says only use default models as AI. But that's a bit of a bug. Not encountered that one before. Okay, I've just had to reload and get rid of the AI traffic because that was pretty annoying. So yeah, bug to get rid of that, but we should be okay now. So you can choose to fly with the Microsoft Flight Simulator default 530. I ain't going to do that. We're going to use the PMS GTN 750. Much better instrument there, so we're going to run that. Next thing on the iPad that you can set up is what configuration the aircraft is in. Obviously, we're going to run cold and dark because we're going to do the full startup procedure. And it also gives you a basic takeoff and landing checklist for you to use in flight, which is, yeah, pretty handy. Pretty basic, but pretty handy. Little word on the documentation. Carenado actually do supply some really useful pages taken directly from the real aircraft's POH. They're a bit tricky to find. They're actually in the sort of one of the root folders of the aeroplane. You have to kind of dig through them in your in the mods folder, but the official mods folder, if you get what I mean. When you find the aircraft, to find it in there. So once you do find those, yeah, some great documentation in there. You can use those, the checklists, and there's also emergency procedures, performance documentation, all sorts of stuff. So definitely recommend having a look at those. There's also various different checklists, and there's even a full POH if you just Google Cessna 337 POH. There is a full one uploaded there, so there's plenty of information available online for all this kind of stuff. So, without further ado, let's crack on and get the airplane started up, shall we? So, starting checklist. So, I'm using the real-world checklist here. Unfortunately, the Microsoft Flight Simulator checklist does not work with this airplane. It doesn't really, as far as I know, it doesn't work with any Carenado airplanes. A little bit of a shortcoming. I would like it if they implemented those. It does make it much easier, especially if you're unfamiliar with the plane and you just want to get going quickly. But never mind. So, seats and belts secure. Yeah, brakes set and tested. So our parking brake is set. Master and alternator switch on. So this is going to be a honeycomb yoke switch for me. You see the switches are there. And you can hear the gyro instruments, the electric gyros running up. And we can see this really cool digital exhaust gas temperature and cylinder head temperature gauge here firing up as well, which is really, really cool. Landing gear, handle down, neutral and green light on. So there we go. There's our landing gear. Now this is something for some reason we've not got the little green light at the top there. It's down here. So yeah, fun and games. Gear down 3 green. Well, yeah, if you can see it. So it can be very difficult to spot that one. Thankfully, I've got a Honeycomb Bravo, which has gear indicator lights on it, so I can check 3 greens on that. In the real airplane, of course, you've only got 1 green light, so generally what good practice is to look out the windows and have a look if you can see the main gear down and locked. But yeah, A little bit of a quirky feature of the aeroplane there. Okay, cowl flaps set open, so we've got electrically operated cowl flaps on this aeroplane. You can see the switches for them here, front and rear. They're both set to the open position. Fuel selectors, front engine left main, rear engine right main, so each engine burns from a different wing tank, which is pretty standard for multi-engine aeroplanes. And the front one burns left, rear one burns right. And front left, rear right is kind of the control setup of this aeroplane, so it applies to throttles and mixtures and props as well. So the front one is the left, the rear one is the right. One of the weird things I had to do when I set up my controls for this aeroplane is I had to swap around engine 1 and 2 on my Bravo throttle, because for some reason engine 1 isn't the left side, it's the right on this aeroplane. I don't know. I guess it's just the way Carenado kind of rigged it up. So if you do have 2 throttles available to you, you will have to kind of flip them around. But thankfully, you can make a custom profile in Microsoft Flight Simulator for each aeroplane, so not a big deal. Radios and electrical equipment are all off. Obviously, we don't want to be draining the battery too much. Mixture's rich, so we're going to start the front engine first. That's standard practice in this aeroplane, apparently, because the wires between the starter motor from the front engine and the battery are a bit shorter, so you actually get a bit more boosting power when you're starting the front engine. So it's usually good practice to start the front one. Also, from a kind of safety perspective, you'd probably want to start the front one first, because you can actually see the propeller arc of the front one and see if there's anybody standing in it, whereas the rear engine, there could be somebody stood right next to it in prime mincing position, and you would never know. So mixture's rich, prop, check high RPM, which it is. Throttle cracked open an inch, so let's give it a little bit of throttle. Auxiliary fuel pump switch on low, so both front and rear have a high and a low setting for their auxiliary fuel pumps. We're going to use the low setting, and then we're going to crank it over pretty quickly, because according to the POH, it's quite easy to flood the engine if you leave this on for too long. So we'll do that. Correction. We'll do that, because that's the front engine, that's the rear engine, silly boy. And we're going to crank over the front engine. And fires up very nicely. And oil pressure is in the green for the front engine. RPM, we're going to bring the RPM up to 1000 RPM. It's looking good. And then we repeat the process with the rear engine. So, okay, throttles forward, props full forward. We've cracked the throttle a little bit. Can knock the aux pump off the front engine, turn it on for the rear engine, and crank it up. Oil pressure very quickly coming into the green. No warning lights, and 1000 RPM. Happy days. Aux pump can go off now. Okay, we'll put our beacon light on. That's pretty much it, apart from whacking on the avionics, which we'll do now. There we go. So looking good. Check the message. Yeah, happy with that. And weather radar, we'll put it on to standby, let it warm up. Just do a quick test. There we go. And we'll do a quick check of our navs and comms. So comms I'm not going to bother, because there's nobody talking to us in the simulator today. So we'll put the ILS on there. And we've got a text ident. The DME is working there. And also it's showing up on the localizer bar on our HSI as well. ADF, we will pop in the NDB frequency at Doncaster here. Spin it over. It's pointing at the beacon, and they still haven't implemented it, so you can do this and check that it parks on the wing, but that's what you do in real life. You'd also get an audio ident, but it's incredibly quiet at the moment for some reason in Microsoft Flight Simulator, so I'm not going to bore you with that. I am, however, going to get the stopwatch set up on elapsed time, so in case I need the stopwatch, it's going to be there. And that's pretty much all of that. We could do an autopilot test, but it's just the default Microsoft Flight Simulator autopilot, so it doesn't actually sort of follow the bugs or anything that you would get in the real aeroplane. Right, I guess it's time for us to get taxiing. So let's release idle the throttles, release the parking brake, and add a little bit of power, and away we go. Pop our taxi light on. Takes quite a chunk of power to get it moving, which, I mean, pretty much makes sense for an aeroplane of this kind of weight. But once it is moving, it rolls along quite nicely, which is pretty good. As you might imagine, we're moving quite a lot of air along. Now, like I said, we've got 15 degrees outside air temperature, which is not all that warm. But if this were a hot day, I'd possibly consider taxiing on just the front engine, because as I said in the hangar, the rear one is prone to overheating. And if this were a really hot day, I'd probably defer starting it up until we got to the holding point or wherever we're going to do our power checks at, just to save the engine from overheating. Now, one thing you probably noticed is the sounds these engines are making. I think they're absolutely fantastic. A lot of the time, Carenado interior sounds aren't too great. I think they've really knocked it out of the park with this one. It sounds brilliant inside and outside as well. This is a really great sounding aeroplane. Runs two Continental IO 360C engines, not to be confused with the Lycoming IO 360, which is a 4-cylinder. This is two 6-cylinder engines, 210 horsepower each, leading up to that magic figure of 420 horsepower in total. And a relatively small aeroplane like this with a small frontal area, 420 horsepower, does result in some pretty spicy performance, as we'll see when we get going. In terms of handling characteristics, pretty nice and stable, reasonably heavy on the pedals. Brakes aren't overly sensitive. Just what you want, really. Again, disclaimer, I've never flown one in real life. I'm just kind of guessing what it would be like to taxi one of these. Something that it would be nice if they implemented, I think, is if they actually did make the rear engine heat up a little bit more than the front one as you're taxiing around. Make it a little bit more prone to heat soak. That would be a nice little touch. We're using runway 20 today. As I said, there's no wind about, so we don't have to worry about that. But of course, we would normally turn the aircraft into wind for the power checks. So, parking brake is set. Cowl flaps are set open. Let's double check that they are. Yep, the little blue lights are on. Flight controls full and free. Let's dip our viewpoint down a little bit. Left hand down, left side up, right hand down. Right side up, other side opposite. The weather radar very helpfully blocking our view there. Full aft and full forward. Can't really see that, but we do have full travel. And with being a Cessna and having a semi-castering nose wheel, we can check the rudder travel as well while we're parked up here. Okay, controls are full and free. Elevator and rudder trim to takeoff settings. So rudder trim can go in the middle, and takeoff setting there on the elevator trim. Okay, so now we've got the engine run up. So normally you would do this at 1800 RPM in the real aircraft. At the moment, there's some kind of weird bug with Microsoft Flight Simulator whereby constant speed props can't be cycled. There's like not enough energy in the governor unit to make the prop work below about sort of 2000 RPM or so. So I'm going to add a little bit of extra RPM here and do this as a higher power setting than you would in the real aircraft. This is again a kind of a no-no with the real plane, because the rear engine is definitely going to overheat if you start revving it right up, especially on a hot day. So suspend belief a little bit while I do this. Okay, power set. Magnetos. Check the front engine. Careful when you're doing that, not to turn it off. Or to start. Rear engine. About 100 RPM drop on that one. And about 100 RPM on the right mag as well. Got to be quite careful when you're doing that with the scroll wheel. Propellers, so let's do a quick check. We'll do the front engine first. Feathering check. It's good. It doesn't say to cycle this 3 times, I'm just doing it out of habit really. You can see the oil pressure's fluctuating as well, which indicates the governor unit's working as it should be. And we're getting no oil over the top of the cowling either. Do it for the rear engine now. Changing sound. And we would be getting a change in manifold pressure in real life, but again, Microsoft Flight Simulator doesn't do that. Fluctuation in oil pressure. And unfortunately for the rear engine, we can't tell if it's leaking oil all over the place, so we have to just trust it, really. Alternators check, so we make sure we are getting a charge. And it's tricky to see this one because it's all the way over here, but it is on the positive. We can pop our landing light on quickly and make sure there's a bit of a fluctuation, which there is when you turn it on, so happy with that. Engine instruments are all in the green, although we are getting a little bit hot, so I'm going to close the throttle now. Suction's good. And happy days. Just make sure the engines don't stop when you bring them all the way back to idle. And then reset to 1000 RPM. We'll set our flight instruments for departure, so we're going to use runway 20, so let's set our course bar to runway heading. And the heading indicator, I'm just doing this with the Honeycomb Bravo controls, by the way. There we go. We'll just check our flight instruments, so that's reading what it should be, not broken, that's nice and upright. QNH is set 29902. One of the downsides is that you only get the American style inches of mercury, not the European style millibars or hectopascals, but it is what it is. 10 coordinators in the middle, balls in the middle, and that's agreeing with the compass. It's all set up, heading bug and course bar. Vertical speeds reading 0. Nav radio is set, checked, idented as best we can. So that is that, and autopilot is set off. Cabin doors and windows are all closed. We do have an opening window here, with which we can fill the interior of the aeroplane with 6-cylinder engine noise, but it is closed. Parking brake release, and off we go. I'm going to set the wing flaps now. So POH does recommend that you depart with 1/3 flaps set. That's exactly what we're going to do. Rotating at 75, using full power. It's a normally aspirated aircraft, not turbocharged, so we don't have to worry about anything like that. Any overboost or anything like that. So reduce throttles, release parking brake. Bit of power to get it going. And we'll do our normal lineup checks, which is approach path, clear left, clear right, transponder, onto mode Sierra in this case. Pitot heat, and this is a switch on the Honeycomb, but it's just there in the aircraft, is on. And all the lights, so landing and strobe can go on now. Now the technique which is preferred by pilots of these airplanes is to go full power on the rear engine first and make sure the rear engine is working properly before you bring the front engine in, and it just ensures that you aren't trying to make a single engine takeoff. So that's exactly what we're going to do. You know, full power on the rear engine, keep the front one at ground idle for now. Okay, power set, brakes off, away we go. Bringing in the forward engine now. Full power set both engines. SB's alive. .75 and rotates. Away she comes very easily off the ground. Passing blue line speed, that's takeoff safety speed, insufficient runway remaining. Touch the brakes, gear select up. One of the quirks of this aeroplane's unbelievably complicated gear is that it actually creates a lot of drag when the gear retracts because of all the clamshell doors and stuff that open up in the fuselage. So it's a good idea to make sure you're well away from the ground before you pull it up. Okay, flap select up now. And setting climb power. 25. 25. And 100 knots we have, so we should be getting about 1,500 feet per minute rate of climb. That is exactly what we're getting. So spot on so far from Carenado on the performance. Brilliant. In terms of the handling so far, rotation off the runway, nice and easy. That very effective elevator, very easy to pull the aeroplane off the ground as long as you've got the right trim settings. She's lovely and stable. Just one of those sorts of aeroplanes which is really nice and smooth and stable and very easy to fly accurately. Now, one thing you've got to remember, every sort of 1,000 feet or so with a normally aspirated aeroplane, push those throttles forward to make sure you're maintaining climb power. Now, one of the things about a normally aspirated aeroplane, it will progressively lose power the higher it climbs. So I'm expecting the throttles to be pretty much full forward by the time we get to about 5,000 feet. But we'll see how she does with that. You can see the manifold pressure is dropping off again. So I'm going to push them back up to 25. And you can see we're doing really, really well on the performance. I've also checked the performance at various different takeoff weights, and it matches the book figures at all takeoff weights, which is really good. Shows they've put some real time and effort in to get the performance right, at least in terms of climb. Okay, passing 4,500 feet now. Got the throttles fully open, and we can only make 24 inches of manifold pressure, so that's indicating that we've basically passed our critical altitude, and unfortunately we're going to be losing a bit of horsepower the higher we climb. Cessna did make a turbocharged version of this aeroplane, which obviously has much, much better performance at higher altitude. Sadly, this isn't that particular version. So you can see our rate of climb is letting off a little bit. And we're going to level off here. So after takeoff checks, flaps are up, gears up, T's and P's are all good, landing and taxi lights can go off. And we're going to trim out for the cruise. So typical with relatively fast aeroplanes, you need a lot of trim. You need to be fairly switched on when you level off from a climb, because it's very easy to just carry on climbing as the aircraft accelerates. Bring the props back very slightly. And we're going to set up for the cruise. So I'm going to bring the fuel flows back to about 70 pounds per hour. And we can also corroborate that with the exhaust gas temperature gauges there. So we're going to lean for peak EGT, which should be about 70 pounds an hour. There we go. A little bit less than that, but well within acceptable variance. Let's get the cowl flaps closed. Temperatures are looking a little on the high side, but good. This should be coming down now. We're in the cruise. And I'm going to pop the autopilot on in heading and altitude hold mode. Of course, we're going to let us speed up without my dodgy flying and see what kind of airspeed we can get. So outside air temperature is about 45 Fahrenheit. So we're going to set 45 Fahrenheit on the top here with a pressure altitude of 5,500 feet. About there. And you can see we're doing about 165 knots. We are still accelerating a little bit though, so we'll give it a little bit longer to speed up. Okay, so you can see we're getting about 165 knots. Maybe we can use the ground speed essentially as our TAS as well as using the little scale here. But it does kind of match up with what our scale is giving us too here, so that's pretty good. Now, according to the real aircraft's cruise performance data, with about 24 inches of manifold pressure, which we have at about 23.5, and 2,500 RPM with the mixtures leaned out to peak EGT, we should be getting about 162 knots. So give or take 3 knots, we're absolutely bang on the money. So in terms of climb and cruise performance, Carenado have got it spot on. So really pleased with that. Rightio then, let's pop the autopilot back out again and hand fly. So what we're going to do next is we're going to slow things down a touch. So I'm going to bring the power back to about 19 inches, props back to, let's go back to 2,300 RPM. Get things slowed down, because we are going to do our general handling sortie, and our general handling sortie is going to consist of some steep turns and a couple of stalls. So let's do our HASTE check. So height is sufficient to be recovered before 3,000 feet. Airframe is clean. Safety and security, all secure. Engine, TCP is good. I'm going to pop the auxiliary fuel pumps just in case. Don't know if that's a standard thing to do in the Cessna 310, but I'll do it just in case. Location and lookout, so we're clear of active airfields, built areas, controlled airspace, danger zones. And lookout turn, well, there's no traffic in the sim anymore. Get rid of the flight director. And we're going to go into our manoeuvre, so we're going to start off with some steep turns. So about 135 knots is a perfectly reasonable speed to be going into a steep turn from. We go to all the way around to the left. I'm going to bug my heading, so I know what to roll out on. And as I was saying in the hangar, the great thing about being sat forward of the wing is that you don't actually have to sort of do the old lift the wing check that you have to do with most high wing aircraft, especially Cessnas, because you can actually see above you and below you, so great visibility on this aeroplane. Right, let's go. So bank, balance and back pressure. Quite a lot of back pressure required, which you'd probably expect from fairly heavy aeroplane, stubby square wings. Tend to require quite a lot of elevator input to maintain altitude in a steep turn. I'm just maintaining about 45 degrees angle bank, which is standard steep turn for a commercial pilot's license test schedule. She's not dropping a great deal of speed, which is nice to see. Quite similar to the Arrow in that sense. It doesn't lose a huge amount of speed in a steep turn. Not a great deal of rudder required either, but you generally don't. And a little bit of opposite rudder and roll out of the steep turn. Push off that back pressure so we don't climb. Yeah, that felt very good. Nice and heavy on the controls. Reasonably responsive though, nice and stable. So happy with the performance of the aircraft in a steep turn. That's pretty much what I'd expect of an aeroplane like this. Okay, so our next item is going to be a full stall in the clean configuration. So Hazel check's complete, but we're going to go full forward on the mixtures. And I'm going to come back on the power all the way. That annoying noise you can hear is the gear warning horns. Go full forward on the props now, ready for the recovery. Very, very nose heavy. So it seems like Carenado have got that handling characteristic absolutely spot on. Now, as far as I can tell, the 337's got a little bit of a tendency to drop its right wing at the stall. From videos that I've watched on YouTube, there's the stall warner. Getting some buffet now. And there she goes. Oh, it's quite violent. But it did drop the wing. Full power, get the wings level. And back up again. Okay, so that did seem like a kind of exaggerated version of what the real 337 does, as far as I can tell, just from watching videos. So yeah, maybe a little bit over the top in terms of the stall characteristics of the aeroplane. We'll do one more, but we'll do it in the final approach configuration this time. So pre-climb to a safe altitude, speed below 140 knots. We'll go gear selected down. And gear down 3 green. Get her into the white arc and we'll start adding some flap as well. One of the interesting quirks of this aeroplane is that the landing gear is not all that draggy at all, and you really don't get all that much drag off of it, which is, as far as I can tell, modelled pretty accurately. We're not actually losing all that much speed here. So flaps 1/3, flaps 2/3, full flap, props full forwards, bringing the power back to idle now. So I'm expecting the aeroplane is going to stall at a much lower nose attitude, but a much lower airspeed. There's the stall warner. There she goes. Oh, she's gone the other way this time. A little bit less violent. Full power, attitude set, positive climb, flap. Gear, flap, and flap again. Okay, gear up, lights out. So yeah, I think the stall characteristics may be a little bit exaggerated, might be a little bit too violent. I know that high-wing aeroplanes do drop a wing on occasion. Can be a little bit snappy at the stall, but I think that's a little bit over the top, personally. And again, disclaimer, I've never flown the real thing, so that could be exactly what they stall like, but as far as I can tell from just watching onboard videos of people stalling them, that's kind of a slightly over-exaggerated response. Okay, so let's set course over here. We've already had the autopilot on once, but let's pop it on again and I'll just show you how it works. So, autopilot's master switch is all the way down here, but I've got one on my Bravo throttle, so I'm just going to use that. I'm going to whack it into heading and altitude hold mode. Again, mode selector is on here, so it's pretty easily accessed. I'm going to reset the aircraft up for the cruise. Okay, we're not going to go too fast though, because what I want to show you is just how complicated that landing gear is. So let's pop outside. I mean, you will notice that the aeroplane has a really distinctive sound on the outside. What that's mostly caused by is the rear engine chopping through the disturbed air from the front propeller. So it has a really distinctive noise. Anyway, all I'm going to do is I'm going to select the gear down and let you have a look at the unbelievably complicated mechanism that operates it. So you can see these big doors here opening, the big clamshells in the rear. The nose gear was positioned flat. There we go, gear fully extended. The doors are closed. And it is very sleek, there's very little hanging out in the airflow. But unbelievably complicated. Select the gear back up again, you can see all the doors opening. The front ones are electric, rear ones are hydraulic. And all closed up there. So, because that gear is so complicated and there's so many doors and stuff hanging out in the airflow, it actually causes a huge amount of drag. So, something to consider when doing a go-around or in a single-engine situation is normally on an aircraft in that sort of situation, you get the gear up as soon as you can to get the drag away. On this aeroplane, you probably want to defer it until you're at a safe altitude, because you are going to lose a lot of your performance when you do go to crank the gear up. Right, so let's put a route in our autopilot. It looks like we're fairly close, so we're going to have to start descending pretty damn soon. Let's do a direct to Echo Golf Bravo November. Enter. Enter. We're going to go straight into nav mode on the autopilot and see how it follows that. Remember to change modes on your CDI, of course, if you want it to follow. Tracker 128, so we make sure to flip this onto the desired track. And given that we are only 8.6 miles away, we're going to start setting the aeroplane up to descend now. So we're going to mixtures full forward, bring the throttles back. Whoop. Not that far, just as far as we can. And we're going to take it out of alt hold mode, and then we can use the pitch wheel to set a rate of descent. Now, something that I've noticed is the animation on the pitch wheel is the wrong way around. So when you roll the wheel down, or roll the wheel forward for a pitch down, it actually rolls up and vice versa. So that's should be a fairly easy fix. Hopefully they'll get on that reasonably soon. Now, something that the pilot's operating handbook recommends is, because the aircraft is quite slippery, and because the gear doesn't add a huge amount of drag, you can actually drop the gear outside of the traffic pattern, is what it recommends. So we may do that, given that we've got to drop a lot of altitude here, and you can see we can't really maintain a particularly high rate of descent without gaining excessive airspeed. For example, if I want to do 1500 feet per minute, I've got the throttles at idle. If we go props full forward to add a bit of extra drag, even with that, we're just about hitting 140 knots, which is still pretty fast. It's probably faster than you really want to be joining a circuit at. So don't forget you can use that gear as a bit of an air brake. So we'll do our pre-joining checks. So fuel we'll check is on, not cross-fed, and sufficient. We've got plenty in the tanks. Radios we'd have all set up to talk to Nottingham. Engine T's and P's, all good. Mixtures are set full rich. Altimeter set air fuel to QNH. And DI agrees with the compass. Okay, so because we started our descent far too late, I'm going to pop the autopilot off and just do a couple orbits to help lose some altitude. Knock the flight director off. Also going to try and get a below 140 knots and get the landing gear down. Use that bit of extra drag to help. So speed below 140, gear select down. And down 3 green. Can idle the throttles all the way now without hearing that annoying gear warning horn. So let's put a runway centre line on here. I'm going to use runway 27 at Nottingham. Okay, so quite slippy aeroplane. It's quite tricky to keep it to a reasonable sort of circuit speed. I'm aiming for between 100 and 115 knots. Ideally, we don't want to be stonking around the circuit at a small GA airfield, potentially swallowing up all sorts of slower aircraft and helicopters in front of us. Just getting it down to circuit heights. Turn just before we get to the village of Tollerton there, just in front of us. 30-degree angler bank. Would help if I put the CDI bar on runway heading as well. That's good for situational awareness. Okay, pointed just at the edge of Cotgrave here at the woods. Looking for 950 feet on the QNH, which we have. About 14 inches set. She's staying steady at about 105 knots, so happy with that. Pre-landing checks, brakes checked, undercarriage down 3 green. Mixture's full rich, mags are on both, fuel's on and sufficient. Flaps, speed below 110, flaps 1/3. Bit of power to counteract that extra drag, because they are very big flaps on this aeroplane. Instruments are on the green, and checked. Car piece we don't have. Hatches and harnesses secure, and the lights can go on. So coming around the corner now, what we try to do with aircraft with electric flaps, we don't deploy flap in a turn just in case you get an asymmetric extension. So just hold off on taking 2/3 flaps until we're wings level, which we'll take now. 2/3 flaps. We're ready for that balloon. It's quite significant. That's just controls being a bit weird as I'm looking around. Try and keep it above 90 until we're on final approach. A little bit high. And go flaps full now. Reds, blues, greens. So that's check mixtures full forward, props full forward, 3 green lights. Looking for 80 knots. Lots and lots of nose-up trim required, so those heavy characteristics really represented well. Whee! Bit of a bounce, full power. Flaps up. 75, and away we go. Okay, positive climb, gear up. And climb power. With the performance of this aeroplane, we're going to very, very rapidly be at our desired altitude, so careful not to be caught out by that. Back on the power nice and early. Something I've noticed is as soon as you kind of get to the edge of this green band on the power, if you're below about 110, 120 knots, the prop governors stop working and you start losing RPM. Don't know if that's realistic or not. Normally with the arrow, you'd have to be about 80 knots or so before the prop stops maintaining RPM. So might be something a little bit strange going on there. Going downwind, this one's going to be a flapless approach. Make our downwind radio call, brakes pressurized, undercarriage speed below 140, gear select down. Mixtures and mags are full rich and on. Fuel's on as sufficient. Flaps, speed below 110, flaps select 1/3, a bit of power to compensate. Watch out for the balloon. Instruments, green, carb heat don't have, hatches and harness are secure, the lights are still on from last time. Trying to make 30-degree angle of bank turns when you're in the circuit. Try and keep it as tight as is practical. Okay, flaps select 2/3, ready for that balloon. Be ready with that nose up trim as well as the aeroplane starts slowing down. Lots of nose up trim required. In fact, I'm using flaps. I said I was going to do a flapless approach, so let's retract that. I'm going to come in about 90 knots with this one. So I'm expecting it's going to be quite tricky to get the airplane slowed down for this. Reds, blues, greens. Something I've not done is get the cowl flaps open. So yeah, really tricky to get extra height off when you've not got the flaps to help you. Very floaty aeroplane. Just get the wheels to touch and then we'll go. Okay, full power. And on this one we're going to simulate a failure of the rear engine. So I'm just going to pull the throttle all the way back to idle on the rear engine. And as you can see, there's no real gyro effects or anything like that, asymmetric effects. Getting the stall warner there. I'm going to pitch for best climb. I'm going to see without the rear engine, I've got very little climb performance. So I'm going to set 0 thrust. And according to the aircraft documentation, we should be getting about 500 feet per minute. And that's exactly what we are getting, so single engine performance, very, very effective. Now, 0 thrust setting is a power setting that we can use in a multi-engine aeroplane to simulate a feathered prop. Now this is exactly what we do when we're doing multi-engine training. Now, of course, we're in a flight sim, so what I can do is I can fail the engine for real. So, hey, let's do that. So idle throttle, idle mixture on the rear engine. See the RPMs dropped all the way off. Very little change in sound, but obviously change in the actual climb performance of the aeroplane. Okay, so we're confident we've lost the rear engine. Bring the prop all the way back and then out and down to feather. And if we look outside now, see the rear prop has feathered. You can see the prop is at 0 degree angle of incidence, and it's also stopped rotating as well. So we'll level off there. We'll close the cowl flaps on the rear engine to reduce drag. And we'll carefully bring the airplane round. Now we've got to keep a close eye on the T's and P's for the front engine for this, make sure we don't overheat it. Now we do often shut down engines in multi-engine aeroplanes in real life, just for training purposes, but we would never do it close to the ground in the circuit like this. This is just literally a demonstration of a more realistic sort of emergency engine out scenario. Okay, we're coming into a kind of a wide downwind. Brakes are pressurized, undercarriage is still select down. So you notice I didn't retract the gear because, as previously mentioned, retracting the gear does create quite a bit of drag, and keeping the gear out isn't actually that bad at all. So we've kept the gear down. Mixture of mags, idle on the rear engine, full forward on the front one. Mags, well, we can come off on the mags for the rear engine. Could also come off the alternator for the rear engine. That's our secural checks done. We'd probably turn the fuel off on the rear engine too, like that. Going to make a slightly wider approach. We're going to go around the back of cock reeve this time, just to give us a little bit more time. Fuel is set up now, on the front engine, off on the rear one. Flaps we're going to defer. Instruments are looking okay, apart from obviously the rear one's dead. Hatches and harness is still secure and the lights are still on. So we're going to make this a full stop landing this time. Okay, coming around the back of cock reeve. I must say, I really, really like the handling of this aeroplane. Everything I've heard from people on videos and things that I've read about this plane say that it is a real sort of joy to fly. And I think Carenado have done a pretty great job at representing that, in my personal opinion. Okay, I'm going to start bringing the power back a touch now. And we'll go flaps 1/3 just before we start the turn on to final. Keep an eye on our airspeed. We're going to carry some extra airspeed just in case. Always want to keep it at or above blue line speed on an asymmetric approach in any kind of multi-engine aeroplane. Even a centerline thrust one like this. Okay, so the inherently sort of slippy nature of the aeroplane is helping us out here. So we're a little bit high, a little bit fast perhaps than we'd like to be. Probably aim for about 90 knots with this. So we're going to go flaps 2/3 now. Watch out for that balloon, it's quite significant. Okay, we're going to go reds, blues, greens. Looking good. Going to take all the flap now. And let the speed start to come back towards about 85. No slipstream lift, of course, on this aeroplane, so there's nothing wrong with just idling the throttle and kind of floating her in. Typical sort of Cessna landing attitude. Down we go, gently lower the nose wheel. And brake to a stop. Happy days. Okay, so we'll just stop here to do our after landing checks. Power on the front engine back up to 1000 RPM. So flaps can come up, pitot heater can come off. There we go. Always forget which switch that is. Transponder can go on to standby, strobe lights, landing lights off. And let's go and park up, shall we? Oh look, it's our old friend, the Turbo Arrow. Still sitting here since we left it here on the Arrow review. Okay, so here parked up now. Oops, well that's oops, fuel pump on. So can go off. Avionics can come off now. And idle throttle, taxi light can come off as well. And mixture can come off. Beautiful. Mags off. And alternator, battery off. Okay, so I think it's about time that we came to some kind of conclusion about this aeroplane. So this is all just based on my experience flying this aeroplane over the last couple days. I've been trying to get to grips with it, do all sorts of little flights and maneuvers that I usually do when I'm playing around in Flight Sim, and develop my impressions based on that. So let's start off with the pros, shall we? So for the positive elements of this aeroplane, I've got first and foremost the visual model. I mean, this is, after all, a Carenado aeroplane. It looks absolutely incredible, both inside and out. And I mean, geez, it's almost worth the price just based on the way it looks alone. I like the fact that they've gone to the effort of weathering it up a tiny bit as well. Just makes it just seem that little bit more realistic and sit in the world a little bit more comfortably. It's very, very nice. I think they've taken some inspiration from the Just Flight aeroplanes in that sense. There's one over there as a bit of a reference. So yeah, I think the way it looks both inside and out is just fantastic. As you can see, this one has its own interior that's different to the one I showed you in the hangar. So the interiors are all different, as well as the exteriors on the different color schemes. It's brilliant. I really can't say anything wrong about the interiors. You can also, there's plenty of functionality in terms of things like light switches. These all work here. Obviously the sun visors work. And if you crank them down inside, you can see that they work on the outside as well, and all that kind of stuff. So in terms of graphical fidelity, shall we say, it's absolutely second to none. Brilliant stuff from that. The next thing I've got down is the sound model for the aeroplane. I think this is something that sometimes Carenado fall a little bit short. The external sounds are usually very good. The internal, not so much. But on this one, I think they've got the sounds spot on. The startup sounds are brilliant as well. It kind of coughs and sputters and swings into life. And then the shutdown, and the prop kind of spins for quite a while as the engine slows down. It's really good. I really like it. And I think they've done a fantastic job with it. The next point is a really big one for me, and it's how the aeroplane handles. Now, again, I've said this a million times already, this review, I've never flown a Skymaster in real life. I've flown reasonably large Cessna, high-wing Cessnas before, but never a Skymaster. But this flies exactly how I expect the Skymaster to fly. It feels like it's just got the right amount of weight and inertia to it as you kind of maneuver it around. Now, disclaimer, I am very, very lucky to be using a honeycomb yoke right now, and the honeycomb I think is an absolutely brilliant peripheral, and I think it does add a huge amount of realism in itself. So it may be being flattered a little bit by the fact that I'm using a really, really good peripheral to control it with. But I think that not all of it is down to the controls. I think there has definitely been some thought that's gone in to making the airplane handle a certain way, and I think they've done a really great job with that. I really like hand flying this airplane. The autopilot is actually really, really functional too. It's easy to control with the mode selectors here, setting up descents with the pitch wheels, very nice and simple. So, I mean, realistically, the airplane flies really nicely either on autopilot or manually, but it just flies so nicely manually. I can't help but just knock the autopilot off and fly it around by hand, really, when I'm not staring at the outside of it for too long. So yeah, I think the handling is spot on, and obviously, as a pilot in real life, if things aren't handling quite right, it very quickly breaks the enjoyment of playing around in Flight Simulator for me. So that's very, very important. The next item that I've got down is how well it matches up to the Real Aeroplanes book figures. Now again, this is something that means quite a lot to me personally, and I'd imagine to quite a few people who watch this channel it's important to you guys too, that the aeroplane is an accurate representation of the real thing in terms of its performance. And going off the real world figures, this one really hits the numbers. I've tried it at all sorts of different weights. I've tried it on single engine, both front and rear engine, failed, and it works really nicely. It really sits on the numbers. It cruises at the right speed depending on the altitude and some weights and power settings and all that kind of stuff. So I think certainly in contrast to some of the early products that Carenado brought out, they've put a lot of effort into making this one really match the correct real-world performance figures. So I really appreciate the effort they've got into in that sense. Another item that I've put down here as a positive is the fact that the documentation is very good. I think that's including some real-world pages out of the Pilot's Operating Handbook, and it's quite a slug of pages out of it as well. It's not an insignificant amount. It's really nice of them to do. It's a shame that it's hidden all the way down in the sort of root files of the airplanes, but I guess there's no other way for them to package it up, really, given that obviously it's distributed through the Microsoft Store. So yeah, make sure you hunt through your aeroplane files and you find those documents, because they're really good to read and really handy. And if you're like me and you like checking up performance data, it's got the performance data on there too. So happy days. So this is priced at about $29.99 US dollars, €24.99 euros, a little bit less than that in Great British pounds. In my opinion, very competitive price for an aeroplane, which I think a lot of love has gone into making this. You can clearly see that they've really put some time and effort into this, and I think for the sake of, I mean, I spend more than that on lunch in a week. So to me, I think it's well worth it. To me personally, I think that they've done a great job for the price. Something else that Carenado has had on its airplanes in Microsoft Flight Simulator all the way since the Seminole is that they've done a really good job at modeling the feathering, engine feathering animations and things like that. So I think that's a great touch. Just from my perspective as a flying instructor, certainly when I'm flying a multi-engine airplane a lot of the time, I'm messing around doing asymmetric stuff with students. So being able to shut an engine down in flight and it does the correct stuff and it turns the prop and all that kind of stuff. And the fact that it also, again, going back to the performance, it hits the correct performance figures on single engine is a really cool little feature, and again, just shows how much effort they've put into getting this airplane right. And the final positive point is that I just think that this is a really great aeroplane to model in Microsoft Flight Simulator. I just think it's really interesting, unique, quirky, weird little aeroplane that I think I'd absolutely love to fly in real life, and that's kind of translated into Flight Simulator as well. So if you want something that's different, that's unique, that's not like, you know, another sort of jelly mold piston twin, it's completely its own thing, then this is really the aeroplane for you. Now the cons, this is a reasonably short list, which is a good sign. It's in some areas, it's not quite as in-depth as perhaps I would like. Now, the main thing that is missing, in my opinion, is this thing here is the manual pump for the landing gear. Now, not only is this used for lowering the gear, you can also use it to raise the gear. All you're basically doing is adding hydraulic pressure to the aeroplane. Now, the early variants of the Skymaster, this thing was really important, because if you lost the front engine, the only engine that was fitted with the hydraulic pump was the front one. So if you lose the front one, you got no hydraulic pump. So if you want to get your gear up, tough luck, you got to pump it. This particular version, it's a newer variant, and therefore it has a pump on both engines. But you still use this quite a lot. Obviously, if you have a gear failure, you'd use this to add some hydraulic pressure, or you have a pump failure, or whatever. It's really useful in terms of an emergency sense. And also, when you're doing the pre-flight on this aircraft, you can use the manual pump to add pressure to the gear. What it will do, it will open up all of the gear doors and allow you to inspect inside and make sure they're all everything's as it should be inside the gear bays. So that's a really important part of pre-flighting the aeroplane that you just can't do because the thanks Facebook, that you can't do because you just can't get the gear doors to flip open. So it seems a little pedantic, but it would be really nice to see them put the emergency extension in there. Another thing, they've got the switch for the prop synchro phasing, which is this little thing over here. As far as I can tell, it doesn't actually do what it should do. Might need a bit more testing, but essentially what this does is that it shows the difference in the RPM between the front and the rear engine. So it allows you to really line them up properly in flight and get rid of all the kind of audio strobing effect that you get when both engines aren't perfectly in sync with each other. As far as I can tell, it's not quite operating in this aeroplane. So a bit of a disappointment. One of the good things is they have put the heater and demister controls on this aeroplane. They do work properly. One of my sort of bugbears with the Seneca, which, you know, for the most part is one of my favorite aeroplanes in Microsoft Flight Simulator. They didn't add things like the heater controls which you would obviously, when you're IFR, you put the heater controls on to demist the windscreen and to also help it keep clear of ice. So yeah, some little systems really I would like them to add. Another one of the things, like the cowl flaps in real life, these aren't just an on-off switch. They actually have an intermediate setting in the middle, so you can actually open them a little bit if you want to just crank them a little bit open. Again, pedantic, but you know, it would just add that little bit of extra polish to the aeroplane if it would do that. Bit picky again, but I think we've reached the stage in Microsoft Flight Simulator where, such as the Just Flight aeroplanes, they have so many add-on liveries that just ship with the aeroplane. So for the Hawk, for example, has loads and loads of liveries that come with it. And the sort of 4 or 5 that you get with this plane, sorry, 5 or 6, I don't know, something like that, but it's not a great deal, and one of them is just plain white anyway, so maybe they could have added a few more colour schemes. Now, I've been praising the handling characteristics of the aeroplane for the most part, but one thing that I think they have gotten a little bit wrong is the stall. The aeroplane doesn't quite stall like it should do, in my opinion. It should be a little bit more stable, a little bit more benign than it is. It's a bit sort of dramatic. It kind of drops the wing and almost kind of goes into an incipient spin, which is no bueno as far as I'm concerned. A little bit too much. And also, there's a couple of little bugs in here. Now, the thing that I mentioned with the pitch wheels, the pitch wheel goes the wrong way, and also we encountered that weird sound bug as we were sat on the ground at Doncaster. That's very annoying, especially if you like to fly around with all the traffic turned on. So I think that potentially they've got a few little bugs to iron out, but Carenado have been quite good at bringing updates. Certainly to the Seneca and the Seminole, that's had a lot of updates since they were released. So I'm hoping that this will be the same, and they'll continually keep updating and improving it as time goes on. So I think, on the balance of things, I think this aeroplane is really, really good. I really enjoyed flying it. I would go as far to say that it is up there in my estimations with the Seneca, which, like I said a few minutes ago, is one of my favourite Microsoft Flight Simulator aeroplanes. I think this is right up there, and this is going to get just as much hammer from me flying it around as that one does. It's great for IFR flights, with the slight disclaimer that it doesn't have any airframe de-icing or anti-icing, so it is an option. Some of the Skymasters fitted with boots, but this particular one isn't, so bear in mind that you won't be able to get rid of airframe icing if you are flying IFR, doing a VATSIM flight or whatever. That might get a little bit hairy for you. But it does handle, obviously, very nice and smoothly. It's got all the equipment. It's got a good autopilot. Obviously, you can fit the GTN 750, which is an awesome bit of kit. So if you wanted to do IFR Airways flights, all that kind of stuff, it's perfectly capable of doing that. And obviously, it's fantastic at flying VFR as well. And with the brilliant visibility out of the side windows, you can really enjoy the scenery flying around in Microsoft Flight Simulator. So it gets a seal of approval as far as I'm concerned. I think it's great, and I think it's definitely worth the price. So Without further ado, I shall leave you be and stop talking your ear off. If you enjoyed the video, if you enjoy what we do here on the channel, please consider giving us a like or even dropping a subscription to the channel. It really does mean an awful lot to us. We are obviously a very small channel, only just over 2,000 subscribers, so the more the merrier. Please join us on Discord, Facebook, all that kind of stuff. The links are in the description, and hopefully I shall see you next time. Thanks, bye-bye.